Hi everyone, welcome to the academic writing section of resources in our EPQ resource bank. For those of you that haven't joined us before, we'll just do some quick introductions. So my name's Kristina. I am a lecturer in the law school at UEA.
Hi everyone, my name's Rebecca Westrup and I'm an associate professor in the School of Education and Lifelong Learning at UEA.
Brilliant. So there's a few different resources within this academic writing section, but do take the time to go and have a look at the full resource bank. We've got some information about setting your question, getting started with research, referencing quite a few different topics.
So first of all, we need to ask, what is academic writing? To be able to write academically, it is not about using big words that you don't understand. I think that's really important to say, because often my first year students think that it is about using big words, about words that you don't necessarily understand, and they then tend to make long, complicated sentences that don't make any sense to the reader at all. What it is about, and I think this is really crucial, is that it's about being able to communicating to your reader about your particular ideas and your arguments, and using the most simplest words to be able to do that, so that you actually make sense in your writing rather than just using the big words. One of the first things you'll need to do in your extended project qualification essay is to give a context of your research topic, your research design, and what you're actually going to explore as your project. And that's done through what we call a literature review. So as this diagram shows here, the purpose of a literature review, first of all, identifies previous and current approaches to the area. That's really important, because you need to be able to give your reader and your marker of the work a particular context. What's already happened before in the area of research? What have people said? So what key ideas have been discussed already? What are the key findings? It may also identify areas of research where there's been significant development. Okay, and you should always be looking, when you're doing your research, to think about what are the significant areas of development. What are those key points? If you're looking at a particular topic, what are the things that you definitely need to know in that area? It could also identify areas of controversy as well. Are there any areas in the literature that are confusing? Are there any that contradict others? Looking at those ideas will help you to be able to really start to unpick the research that's gone before your study, to be able to analyse that and then give yourself a particular position. It will help you to identify a gap in the literature, so that then you can come in with your project and remember your aims and objectives to be able to answer or address that gap. It also helps you to demonstrate your skills, because remember, that's something that you will be assessed on in terms of how you seek information, how you read information, how you then interpret and analyse that information as well. It will help you to formulate the questions that you then need to look at to be able to explore and develop your project further. It also helps us to reflect on the validity and the reliability of the research. As you'll know from the Getting Started with Research video, that's really important, to be able to assess the credibility, accuracy, the reliability and support for the literature that you're looking at. So a literature review needs to represent your wide range of reading. It will usually include sources such as books and journal articles, and possibly reports as well. They can be reports from research. It may also include policy documents, legislation as well. You can include reports from media outlets, although it's important to think about the validity and the reliability and credibility of those sources in your writing. So it would often, if you do use a media report, do give that report as an example for context, for example, but then also try and then support that with more valid and peer-reviewed literature as well.
Peer-reviewed literature really just means literature that has been reviewed by other experts. So it's been submitted by one expert and reviewed by others. You'll see this in lots of different academic journals, that in order to be published in the journal, it has to be reviewed by the people. It's part of the process of submitting your article.
You'll also need to take an analytical approach to the literature. So being able to be critical of trends and also characteristics. So that's why it's important to have an idea of the general topic area that you're looking at, so that you can question whether the information that you're reading is similar or different to what others have said before you. It should also be thorough, critical and reflective as well, because this will help you to be able to demonstrate your knowledge and understanding of the area that you're looking at and what's already been done in that area, so that you can then have your questions and complete your piece of research. So what do you need to do first of all? The first thing you should do is read skillfully and also with discrimination, because there's an awful lot of literature that you could read, but you only have a certain amount of time to do this, and you'll need to fit your EPQ in around your other studies. So when you first start to look at a journal article or a piece of literature, skim read. Look at the bibliographies and the reference lists. Look at the abstracts, the titles and the headings. What are they telling you? Are they giving you information about your key search terms? Do you think from reading the abstract, for example, that it's going to be a paper that's helpful for you to find out more information? And then read in depth when you know that the information is going to be important for your research. When you're reading, you also need to read actively. So think about within the article, what does it mean that they're saying? Why did they do something in the way that they did? Did they use a particular methodology for a particular reason? Do you think that they've missed something? Could they have used another method to be able to get similar or different results? Do you think it's an appropriate method that they've used? Also try to find patterns or key themes that are emerging from the body of research. There will often be key authors that write about particular topic areas, and so they'll become sort of key authors that you can look at just to identify if there are any key patterns and themes in what they're looking at. So for example, in one of my areas of research looking at gender and education, Professor Carolyn Jackson has written an awful lot about gender and education. So she is someone that I always go to when I'm starting out a topic to see, okay, what has this researcher written about? And then I know that I've got the most up-to-date information in that area. And also keep making notes. I can't stress this enough. You need to make sure when you make your notes that you have a record of the author, the date, also the title of the study and any key bibliographic information, because you don't want to be having to find all of that information at the end.
And for those of you that watched the video on getting started with research, if you're accessing materials online, always keep the hyperlink and the date that you accessed it.
Then in terms of writing, you need to be able to plan your work. You can't just write a literature review from scratch and finish just like that. Well, I don't think you can. I think it's something that has to be crafted, drafted, and then also redrafted, because there's going to be an awful lot of information that you've got to make sense of. One way in which you can make sense of that information is to organise it into themes. So this will help you to be able to give a thematic analysis of the literature that's available, rather than a chronological walkthrough of the literature. Some people have looked at a kind of chronology of what's happened over time in a particular set of literature, but actually what then happens is it becomes very much, well, this person said this, and then this person said this, and the review is more of a description of the literature and the studies and the research that has happened before. What you need to be demonstrating is that you can be critical and analyse that information. So being able to group the information that you've read into themes will be able to help you to do that. A tip that I often share with my students is to write the themes or the ideas on research evidence cards when you're writing. You could use a Word document instead. I tend to prefer paper and flip chart pens, but that's just me. But what you need to do is to be able to move them around so that you can gather a sense of the order and to make sure that the argument makes sense. You may have to do this several times before you have your literature review that you're able to submit, and one that you're happy with as well. And just to remember, it's important to make the point and then use evidence to back that up, and then also evaluate that evidence. So you need to make use of your notes and be critical throughout the literature review. One way in which you can do this is with a critical thinking grid. This is another tip that I share with my students. Because the information is within a grid, our brains like to have a grid completed. So it often means that we're motivated to complete the grid. So for example here, I will have a look at 3 articles, and within those I will then think about, okay, so what are the overview and main findings or the arguments presented within each of the articles? Crucially, how does that then link to my project? And then does it raise any additional questions that I want to go out and find out about from other literature, or something that I want to look at in my project? And what do I think about it? It's really important that you're able to evaluate the literature that you're reading. So do you agree or disagree with what you've been reading? Can you then link your argument, your agreement or disagreement with wider literature as well? So again, is there something in Article 2, for example, or Article 3 that may help you to be able to do that?
And linking that back to what Becca just said about organising into key themes, you can have one of these grids per theme and move it in, or you could add in an extra column that says sort of which theme it links to, however your mind works best, but being able to move those things around is helpful.
So as a reminder, what does it mean to be critical in your writing? Being critical and analytical means asking questions. We first of all have the what question. So what's happening? What's going on? Why is it happening? Why is it also happening in this particular way? You need to be thinking about, are there any other ways that a particular topic or a particular area can be researched, can be explored? What is the effect that is happening? How do we know this? And who says this is the case? Often when you're writing, a good tip is to write, and then when you're reviewing your work, if you can find a particular sentence or a particular paragraph which is, well, who says? You need to give more evidence there to be able to support your point. It's important to think about what other people say. And also then, why should you care about it? What is the personal significance to you? Is there a particular motivation for you in terms of the reading? and also then writing about a particular topic. You need to be careful that you yourself are not too biased or subjective as well in looking at that. So another activity, which is also a tip that I tell my students to have a look at, is when you have a draft piece of work, highlight where you have described, so where you have just told some information, said something has happened, but then also where you have analysed, so where you have been critical, where you have asked those why type questions, and then where you have evaluated as well, so where you have given your agreement or perhaps your disagreement. And crucially, you must be able to explain why you've done those in the places that you've done them.
And being critical is the key difference, and particularly when you get to university level, between what we refer to as good honours and not. So a piece of work, particularly in my discipline, that's largely descriptive will be limited, and it's very unlikely it can score above 58, 59%, because what we're looking for that, what's often known as a 2-1 that you might have heard of, and above, is the evidence of analysis, of particularly of critical analysis within the work. So if the work is more balanced on the descriptive side rather than the analytical, it falls within that lower boundary, which is why it's such a great activity to do, to be able to highlight and see where the balance of your work falls.
And so just as a reminder, before we finish this section, what are appropriate materials? So you should be looking at scholarly, academic, peer-reviewed material, looking at material that presents empirical evidence. So that's primary research with participants to be able to back up claims, not just opinions. It's fine to start with an opinion piece, but you then need to be able to find peer-reviewed and scholarly literature to be able to support that and strengthen your argument and viewpoint. It's often helpful to think about the structure of an article in terms of how well it is written, as well as looking at the journal title, for example. So think about articles with an introduction, methods section, literature review, findings, discussion, implications and conclusion as well. So they could be journal articles, policy documents, dissertations maybe, perhaps ones for master's level and PhD work, and also books as well.
Okay, everyone, so that's the end of the literature review section. The next materials that we're going to look at will be how to structure your writing. So think about what your EPQ looks like. Is it an extended essay or is it an artifact? And then pick the relevant slides.